be clinical, don't be retail. You own the narrative for the patient and it's for the patient's benefit. If you're a retailer, then you're being completely driven by everything else that's happening in the market. So if there's a sale going on, you're now beholden to that sale. If there's advertising going on, you have to be reactive to that. If you're clinical, the thrust, the core of what's happening between you and that person who's in your consult room is solely driven by that person.
Welcome to The Focused View, the podcast for eye care professionals across Australia. Brought to you by Optical. In each episode, we bring together leading eye care, optical and business professionals to share valuable insights, practical tips, and the latest trends shaping the optical business landscape. I'm your host, Michael Nasser, and together we'll explore innovative strategies for practice growth, patient care, and business success in the eye care industry. Whether you're starting your career, managing a practice, or just looking to stay ahead of the field, The Focused View is your source for inspiration and knowledge.
Grant, thank you and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Yeah, good to be here. Thanks.
I'm really excited about today's conversation. We're going to be talking quite technical, I believe, with regards to the aspects and the items that we're going to be talking about, lens focused with a heavy emphasis on lenses. But before we get into it, can you tell us a bit about your background and I guess how you found your way into optics?
Yeah, okay. So, gosh, it was decades ago now. But initially, I think like everyone that was ever in a band, I thought I was going to be a rock star. And so with that, to sort of fund that lifestyle or to pay the rent, ended up getting a job in optics. And that sort of took me into my first exposure with optometry in a practice. And yeah, went for a job, got the job. And from there it was, I don't know if it wasn't the beginning of the end, it was the beginning of the beginning. But yeah, that was sort of my first engagement, was not necessarily drawn into the industry specifically because at that age or at that point in time, there was something that, I have to be in optics. So yeah, paying the rent first got me there. And it's when I started in optics, in optometry, and working as a dispenser in my first job. That was a pretty interesting time because I'd worn glasses my whole life since I was about 18 months old. And interestingly, that was actually, funnily, that was one of the points that when I saw the job was going, that there was a job being advertised. My attitude at the time was pretty much, well, I wear glasses, therefore I should be at least somewhat qualified to go into this job. Probably a little bit cocky, but, they're the things that start the ball rolling, really. And yeah, once I started in the job, there were a lot of sort of revelation moments in that first position that I had, sort of not just clinically, but just in terms of the way that we can interact with people as well. So that was pretty special. And from there, I did my first qualifications. I did Certificate 4, I think like so many other people did that. And then sometime in, I met my now wife on an aid trip in Nepal. And when we got back from that trip, things started happening. We got married and we ended up with buying our own practice in the Southern Highlands in Bowral. And once we got into that mindset, I think, of being in control of what was happening day to day, I started seeing opportunities for ways to us to have more control or better control over what was happening at a technical level in the practice. So before that, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but we were beholden to what the employers wanted. So there was a philosophy or a thought process behind how they worked in the practice. And that's all well and good and absolutely their place to do so. When we found ourselves in the position to be able to have much more control over what was happening and in that aspect of the practice, we started looking further afield for what opportunities there were to develop knowledge and how we might sort of push me forward to benefit the practice more. And so we sent me off to university. I did a degree in mathematics and another major in quantum mechanics in physics. And from there, it really started rolling and opening things up. So after that, I went and did a master's year, like a postgrad year working with Mo Jaley and studying lens design. So I did that. And at the end of that, it was interesting. We sort of ran out of things to do. I asked Mo what comes next. And he said, well, that's it. This is pretty much the limit of what's available for ophthalmic education globally. And even as an undergraduate, I had to cobble together the topics that I wanted to get more of an optics focus, because there really aren't any degrees in optics. It's an adjunct. It's off to the side of most of what we see. So with that in mind, he recommended that I start making some inquiries, say, to Aston University and around. And I was put in touch with Professor Logan, Nicola Logan, at Aston, which began my pathway through their master's program with optometry and eventually resulted in my doctorate. So that's where I really did quite a few years of study. COVID got in the way in the middle. And we started looking at growth patterns and emmetropisation for children and developing an understanding of children's eyes, building model eyes in that space as well. So that's sort of how I ended up where I am today. And inside all of that, as the steps sort of progressed, we noticed that what I was learning was pushing forward beyond what was available in the industry necessarily. And it's not saying that the education in the industry is poor by any measure, but we did find me sort of pushing fairly deeply into each topic. And so we noticed that it gave us an ability to articulate what was happening with not just lenses, but with optical solutions, with pathways in people's development, be that with children or for adults as they move through, say, presbyopia. But we had a really good, deep understanding of what was happening. And so we built this concept of training internally that we could use for our own people. And that would be in the form of, evening webinars or seminars and online content, quizzes, those sorts of things. And that sort of morphed into, or coalesced into, the Academy of Advanced Ophthalmic Optics, which AAOO is sort of where we find ourselves now, delivering CPD content for the industry. So a bit of a scattered pathway, but it ended up having a central thread that sort of pulled everything together at the end.
Yeah. I think the power of what you've just explained there is that there's really a high emphasis there in theoretical knowledge behind the products within the industry, and I, whether that be lenses or other optical sort of solutions, you've sort of really gone for that next level of understanding from a theoretical point of view, and obviously with the shop that you've got that practicality side of things as well. So you're really approaching it from a holistic nature, from the theory behind it all, and then how is that actually translating into a service to patients, and what are they seeing from that point of view, I guess, pardon in that instance. But so obviously that led to the AAOO, which you mentioned, and it's totally makes sense how that transition has occurred. What is AAOO, and I guess tell us more about that particular, I guess, that program and that course.
Right. So initially, we looked at the way that we were practicing in our location in clinical space, and what we noticed is that at a lot of points we started doing things that were working, and they were working very well, but it was almost out of habit. It was like a gut reaction to what you see, and so it became like for want of a better term, like a ChatGPT version of practice. You know what I mean? Like a statistical model. We've done this for so long, we've seen so many people, and so every response that we had was coming out of a place of experience, of course, and was leading to good results, but we couldn't necessarily in that moment articulate exactly why it was being successful. And that struck us as a really big weakness in what we were doing as individually as practitioners. And so as a practitioner, I think it falls upon us not to slip into practicing out of habit, but to always make sure that at any point we're able to explain what we do. And that can be a little bit confronting as a practitioner, because you have to not just say, well, I'm getting it right, but also there will be instances where it's not working, and examining both of those equally. So not disregarding the patient who didn't have a positive outcome as being an outlier, but actually really drilling into that and saying, why was that the case? And then also saying, why is this lens design working so well, or why is this approach working so well for patients? So we took that mindset of, we have to have backing for it. We have to have proof. We have to have some sort of an evidence base for why we're behaving as we are as practitioners, and build that into a structure. And that's also really difficult, because we now have to articulate not just what the pathway is that worked for a patient, for example. So, why did I choose a particular corridor length for a progressive? But to build the case for why that's working, not just for this patient, but for any other patient who is in similar conditions, and then pull that even further back and say, right, well, what is the variable? What is the element of this particular part of the design that we can play forward to modify for patients who are in different scenarios. And so having this ability to pull things back to their core components or look at first principles drove us into the AAOO space. And the first iterations of the course were really quite technically heavy. I think they were probably heavier than they needed to be at that point. But we were trying to coalesce everything into one CPD course. So we directed it at optometry, we directed it at dispensers, and it was received really quite well. But what we did see was that there was scope for separating the components out to make them a bit easier to digest. And so that led to first generation courses and second and third generation courses. And now I think we're 7 or 8 years in, and sort of the portfolio of courses has spread out quite a bit. So we work in a couple of different threads. We look at CPD for optometry and for optical dispensers, so opticians. And then we also have bespoke pathways, which will work with individual practices. So we can come and work with practices for their particular needs. Every practice has its own little idiosyncratic points that need to be addressed and should be addressed. So we work in that space. And then we also work with laboratories as well to do bespoke programs that work with their core technologies, some of their core principles, the philosophies towards lens design, so that they can articulate those to their client base. And so that's led us to an international audience there as well. It was sort of interesting that Australia, I mean, obviously we have clients here and we work well in Australia, it's our home, but we had as much, if not perhaps a little bit more engagement internationally through Europe and Southeast Asia initially with the courses, certainly a lot more than we expected, I think. And that was really quite something. It was quite heartening for us because I think it gave us the confidence to really push forward and start developing more and more materials.
Yeah, and I feel like, obviously that need from an Australian point of view could be limited somewhat, but then when you open up the European and the Asian markets, I can imagine that there is a lot more of an initiative or for information, I guess, or knowledge, of the want for knowledge for information. You've mentioned a couple of things, the lens designs and the way that you analyze lens designs and the way that all works. Something you mentioned to me prior to today's conversation was that you're not actually tied with any one lab specifically, right? Like, I mean, the way that you do your analysis and the way that you conduct your research, it really is not tied to anything or any lab, from that point of view. Why is that important to you? And I guess, why is that made known?
Yeah, I think for us to have utility or to be useful for any laboratory, we need to have a really strong measure of independence, because the risk that I think that a lens company or a laboratory runs is that they can get mired in PR, in advertising, and sort of fall into advertising speak and have that sort of promotional thrust to everything that they do, which you obviously need. You need that to bring the product to the patient's, in front of the patient, but in front of the practitioner's mind. And so that's a really important part of it, of course. But there has to be a justification for why a practitioner would be wanting to engage with a product or with a certain type of technology. And the only way to do that is from first principles. And we believe that that first principles concept isn't linked specifically to any lab. So we can look at research. We can look at research you can look at the Minkwitz condition. You can look at model eyes. You can look at behavioral optometry. And they all have an independent knowledge base, which is where the lens designs come from. So there's no secret out there about the knowledge base, right? It's all research backed, it's being published, but we separate ourselves from a laboratory quite rigidly. Actually, it's sort of one of the core principles that we hold to. We will work with some companies more than others, and that's just sort of something that happens organically. But when it comes to the core principles behind a lens technology that company XYZ is endorsing, we only have use for that company if we can pull it back to first principles and provide proofs for why this lens might be behaving what advantages it might have, and how then you can break it again into core principles that you can apply to a patient.
And I love what you said earlier when you said, that there's technologies, but there's also a philosophy. And most lens companies, or lens design companies, have philosophies that they fundamentally stick to. And I guess being independent in the way you are allows you to analyze all of them and I guess, understand the differences between them as well and notice those too. But from that point of view, what gaps are you currently seeing, I guess, now when it comes to the knowledge of practitioners and dispensers regarding lens design specific?
For me, the gap that I see is a broad stroke gap. And all of the fine cases, the sort of really individual cases, stem from one major point, which is the lens designers and the lens groups. So you have these research groups that are coming together with work, and they're coming up with really great lens designs. And look, most labs will have a suite of really good lens designs, and that might come from third parties, or it might be something that they've developed internally. But the people and the groups that are developing these really do run at the front of the pack. They're incredibly complex, really well delivered lens designs, but they're developing at a pace which is sort of outstripping the development of the practitioners. So we're getting what is initially a little divide, and has over the last 20 years been progressively steady, progressively widening, so that what the lens designers think is a reasonable articulation of a point isn't matching up with what the practitioners are looking at as, from their perspective. So there's this bifurcation or a split apart of not necessarily knowledge levels. I think everyone's capable of understanding what's going on, but the lens design groups are really running fast ahead, and the articulation of what they're achieving and what is possible through a lens design hasn't kept up as well as it could. And that's where we sort of are trying to operate in that gap.
Bridge that gap.
Yeah, we were working on one of these points this morning, bringing together large-scale modeling of the visual systems, and it's a really complex task to perform. So part of our job is to break that into its parts, make it palatable for the industry as a whole, so that practitioners can say that I want that for my patient, or that has no use for me in my practice because I have other philosophies in place. So
yeah. Is it fair to say that you've got your lens designers, and obviously with the way that the industry is positioned and the way that it's delivered, the labs obviously are the conduit at this point between that lens designer, if they happen to work in-house as part of the ecosystem of the particular lab, or whether it's a third party that provides it to other labs to produce. And obviously having some exposure to the lab life, I'm sort of somewhat aware of what that may look like. But from the point of view then of the delivery, the lab then carries the weight of the educational piece of that. And something I've observed, and I'm not sure if you would think the same, is that there's not as much technicality in that delivery of training as there once was. Is it fair to say? And do you think that that's something that is driven from the labs in terms of trying to sell the product or market the product, as opposed to actually getting into the optics and the technicality of the product? And do you think it's more lab driven, or is it more the industry is driving that from the practitioner level? And how would you speak to that, I guess, that wandering away of optics?
It's hard, isn't it? Like, where I have watched it happen, I can't pinpoint the source of it. I don't know what the source of this mentality was. But at some point over the last 20 or 30 years, the concept of they don't need to know that much detail has come into the articulation industry. And that's something that I have heard put forward at conferences when I've walked out of rooms, things like that. There was a lot of detail in that. I don't think that any of that is necessary. And depending on the practitioner, it may not be. I mean, maybe they are not interested in delivering at that level of detail, and that's fine. But unfortunately, that has become the default. And there's not necessarily a pathway to get the level of detail that people who want it can access. And so that's the catch. I think like I said, I don't know exactly where that's come from in the industry, but there was a point where it became the case where you had to go and find out for yourself. If you wanted to know why, our progressive lenses gives you 20% more reading. And my question was 20% more than what? Because we need to have a baseline, we need to have a reference, but that got taken away because that wasn't a necessary part of the articulation of the message or the conveying the message. I disagree with that. I think that there should be all of the information and you can dive in as deep as you want.
It's sort of an optional thing as to you, like it should be there as a default, and then it's up to the practitioner potentially to decide how much they want to absorb. Is that essentially what you're...
Right. Treat it like a research paper. You can read the abstract or you can read the rest of the paper as well. But you can get a sense of what's going on. You can get a sense of what is happening in the research paper by looking at the abstract. And I like that. I like that ability to say, the rest of the information's there. Some of the content that we've developed for the short courses and for CPD, for example, we've actually had to go and access patents and read patents and look at, look at it at that degree of granularity, because we've been unable to get the information from other sources because it's just not there.
It's definitely an interesting dynamic, and it is multifaceted. It's from levels, and on this point, and if I ask a question, I guess sort of from the top of my mind here, which is, how do you deal with translating that information to the patient, say? Because you're obviously in the fortunate position of actually speaking to patients on a regular basis. And at what level, like how much does that help you in the conversations you have? And I guess an understanding that it might then lead to maybe practitioners wanting to find out more information. And I want to ask that next. But how do you, I guess, with all the information that you have, how do you decipher that? And what does that look like as an experience for your patient?
Right. Look, what's the old adage? You can't always be one lesson ahead of the piano student. Like, you know what I mean? You can't just stay one lesson ahead of the student. And if we've got practitioners who are only one step ahead of the person that they're trying to articulate a message to, they'll get the message across most of the time. But if you have a patient that asks the next question in sequence, like for example, hey, this gives you 20% more reading. Well, 20% more than what? What does that mean to me?
Yeah.
You do have to have a lot more depth in your knowledge, and that's a difficult thing to transit. So, because the temptation is to say, well, 20% more than, and start talking about lens designs, talk about the interplay between ads and corridors and all of that, and you'll lose your patient. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
But there comes a point where you have sufficient knowledge, and this is the point, I think, where you're ready to start bringing this to the patients, into their mindset. Once you reach a certain level of knowledge, then you're able to articulate that in very simple terms. And that's the art of being the practitioner at the coalface on the practice floor is, we need to talk to patients, to parents of patients, for example, about myopia. There's the big thrust of our generation in practice here, or professional focus for us. So how do you break that down? How do you make that palatable and understandable to a patient? Well, it has to be to their parents as well. So we've got to put it in two contexts. Why is the patient needing to engage? Why do the parents have to engage? This is something I think that's being worked out very well in the industry at the moment. But the way that lenses do their job is still falling a little bit behind. The way that we address it is to say, look, the person who's talking to the patient has to know a lot more than what is necessary to describe to the patient. Yeah. So then we can lay out this is what you should expect from your lenses. This is what your experience is going to be. We can have some sort of a predictive discussion as well. So for example, everyone out there in the industry knows that at 40 to 45 years old, we're going to start seeing our presbyopes, right? We can talk to them at that point about what's going to happen to them when they're in their 50s and what's going to happen to them in their 60s and what happens when they've had the cataracts extracted. We know all of those things with a reasonably high amount of certainty and precision. We can say at a certain point in their journey, they're going to have a 250 ad or an ad that's directly linked to their working distance. We know that that's coming. And so we can articulate that in broad strokes at the very first sort of early presbyo attendance, and then develop the conversation as we move through. We know that progressives aren't going to give a solution for every working condition for a 65, 70-year-old patient, right? So being able to, for us, for example, the conversation of, we talk about how a lens is going to give the patient in their early 40s pretty much everything. Progressive lens should work in most conditions.
Yeah.
But there will come a time when we have to start looking at more novel solutions, extra solutions that will come in. And it's not bad. It's not that things are going wrong. It's just natural. And having that conversation ahead rather than explaining things that have already happened, I think is and that's very simple, but that's one of the examples of how having the extra knowledge.
Yeah.
You don't have to talk to them about the hardening of their lens and accommodative processes or any of that, but we can talk to them about what's coming and how it is natural, and it's not something to be concerned about.
Well, that's a good way of putting it, but it also frames you as a bit of an expert in the field, which is obviously what they're coming to you for. And I think that knowledge component gives you then confidence, and it's that confidence that will help deliver a better service and a better outcome, both from a product selection point of view and a patient experience point of view. And it really stems to that. And I guess if you speak the industry more broadly, that education, that knowledge seems to be getting less and less, but it's also creating opportunities, I feel. And that's the good part of it. And I guess if we speak to that opportunity, the opportunity that it presents, if a practice is listening to this or a staff member is listening to this, they're like, I feel like, I need to up my game when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to understanding the lenses and the aspects of that and what that may look like, how would a practice or individual go about re-engaging with the fundamentals, of lens knowledge specifically and becoming, I guess, more advanced with that particular type of lens knowledge?
Right. Look, the certificate 4 that exists in Australia is a really good starting point. Like that's giving an excellent foundation. So I don't want anything that I'm saying here to think that I'm disparaging that. It exists within a framework, and it has to be a broad strokes approach to what happens in the industry, because there are lots of labs and lots of types of practice. So they're in that set of boundary constraints that they have to be able to give knowledge that can be utilized across that sort of space. So it's the ideal starting point. I mean, we have courses that do give those entry points, and they can actually give a really strong foundation to people who are moving into the certificate 4. But also, as people exit the certificate 4, I've studied it. I've already done that course, and we've worked with lots of our team who've gone through the Cert 4 as well. So we know what the exit point looks like, and we can pick up and run from there. And
I think an evolution of it, basically.
Right.
Fair to say.
And
it's an
speaking
evolution
to that, it is. It's organically catching that and moving forward and saying, right, here's what you know, and now let's start building upon that to give you that depth. I think because, look, the example that I like to use sort of talks for this is, if we have a patient who comes in and they've had a big change, or post-cataract or something, for example, and there's been a significant change in their prescription, right? And at the first sit down with them, we're working on their lenses, and we prescribe, we work out a really great lens and everything's fantastic. And inside ourselves, we go, yeah, you know what? There's a big difference between the eyes here, right? So we know that, and we're comfortable with that. So we prescribe, we dispense to the patient. They come back and they, on collection, say, well, this feels really weird. What's going on? The problem, as I see it, is that we should know at the first consultation, or when we're dispensing the lens, putting it together, that reaction that we had should be articulated to the patient at that point.
Right.
Because when they pick up and say, oh, this is really strange, the tendency I've found in the industry is to say, oh, yeah, that's because there's a big difference between the prescriptions. So we know that. We know the truth. We know exactly what's happening, and we're not wrong. But the reasonable question for the patient is, well, why didn't you tell me that before? Yeah, and it's not a comfortable question, but it's a really reasonable one. If you knew this was going to be a problem before, if you knew or suspected that there was, if we're talking about progressive lenses with ads, the ad jumps up by 0.75. They haven't been tested for a while. Yeah, I know that the reading area is going to get smaller. Well, why didn't we tell them?
Yeah.
All right. And so that can solve a lot of problems for us in advance. It's always better to know the lotto numbers a week before they come out as opposed to the day after. But wouldn't it be great? But and I think that speaks to how do you articulate it as well. If you've got the extra knowledge, then you can drop that in advance, and the patient will be informed before they come back and pick up that set of glasses that might feel a bit funky. But you've given them some sort of assurance that what's going to come is normal.
Yeah. So in that case, if we talk about that course structure that you've got, and obviously it's quite robust and quite dynamic. How does it go beyond the Cert 4? And from the point of view of, helping build a really capable team, which I think effectively is what the essence of it is.
Right. So what we do is, first and foremost, that we'll talk to the CPD course that we run, because there are a few different courses, but this one's probably the best example of how it integrates with the Australian industry. The first phase of the course, we sit down it's about across 12, 13 weeks, depending on the type that you take. And the first couple of weeks is a normalization of the dialogue. So we'll talk about fundamental optics principles. We'll go back, we'll talk about vergence, we'll talk, and how that informs reading prescriptions, for example, and just how lens, the parts of lenses will interact with each other to give us the final result. A lot of things that happen, and I know they happen in the Certificate 4, I know they happen at university as well, but we've gone out into the world and we're working, and some of these things fall by the wayside. Yeah. So the other problem is, depending on which pathway you take or which textbook you use, they'll have different terminology. They might have different variables that they're describing, but the concepts are all the same. So the first step that we look at is, let's normalize the language around it and use sort of the most common discussion points. From there, we go into advanced lens concepts. And in that advanced lens concepts phase, we look specifically at what is and is not possible from the perspective of a lens design. So that gives the practitioners the ability to go to a lab, whatever lab that might be, order a lens and understand a little bit more comfortably why they're receiving the product that they've may not have thought that they've ordered. A lot of the complaints that we get at when we're working with labs is labs will come and say, we've got our clients coming back saying, with compensated powers, that's not what I ordered. And you go, yeah, it isn't. It absolutely is not what you ordered, but there's a reason for that. And giving those principles to the practitioners allows them to not necessarily, if you want, we can go into that pathway and look at how do you do the calculations and the various ways that they might come together and lab philosophies and so on. But what we try to do inside this course structure is say, here are the core principles for how, we'll use power compensation as an example, position of how it happens in 3 dimensions. When you receive a lens back from the lab, this is why they've done what they've done. And if you wanted to, like I said, you can go back and you can study that. We can teach you how to do it for yourself. We've got a calculator on our website that does it for you. So it's there. Right. So there are established principles and then pathways. And like I said, we use the research that's been published on this to develop this, but you don't need to know that as a practitioner. You need to know that it is possible and it's accurate and true. In much the same way as your earlier point about how do we as practitioners articulate things to the patient, they need to have surety that we've gone deep enough to understand it. And that way we're articulating a true message. And we operate in a similar way with this. If you want to know the rest of the story, we can tell it. If you go, yep, I can conceptually get what you're driving at here, this is really comfortable, great, then we move forward and we've got the ability then to talk to the laboratories clearly. If something's not possible and our lens laboratory comes back and says, you just can't have that. It's not the way physics works. They are not going to push back. The arbitrarily thin lens, it's too thick. I want it thinner. All right, well, what are you willing to give up to get that? There has to be that conversation. And empowering the practitioners to ask the question, but also be comfortable with the answer. That's that phase of the education there. And then the final point that we look at is what is at the sort of the edge of the envelope in the industry right now, and what predictively somewhat we see is coming. Now, I've got the benefit of being involved in a research capacity in that space. So, we do our own research, obviously in my own field, but that gives us the ability to speak to, what we're seeing coming from other pathways, what may or may not be possible in the future, for example. And that can start the conversation for the practitioners. Again, a full circle moment in this interview to come back and say, right, what is coming in the industry? What are you trying to articulate to me, as the next steps in lens design? I'm comfortable. Right. I'm more comfortable with that now. You can talk to me at a higher level than perhaps what the marketing material might have been delivering before.
And when people are doing this course, have you got any, at what point do you see any aha moments? Like, are there moments, and where does it happen more often than not when you've got a cohort in front of you, you've got some students in front of you, and you're going through a particular topic? Is there one that you just kind of, you can tell something clicks from essence?
There are a few. Look, there's one that happens early on when we start talking about radius and power. And radius, so the radius of a surface, obviously it's directly linked to the power and your index. And that, the discussion of that just from in terms of like fitting a lens, what are we giving up if we ask for a base 8 lens? What are we sacrificing in terms of control of the design? And how does that turn into, unwanted astigmatism, like, oblique sill, that sort of thing. So those, that's sort of one of the early moments that comes in where people go, right, okay, I hadn't thought of it that way. I actually have to give up something. We've got 3 or 4 things that we can control and we just gave up one of them. And talking at it from that perspective of, a camera lens, like I could pull a camera lens out now that might have 18 or 20 or, a large number of elements in it and give us a beautiful image. Well, with lens design for spectacles, we've only got 2 surfaces and 1 material. That's it. And we have to do all of that all of the heavy lifting happens in that one small space.
Yeah. And that in itself is an aha moment. It's like, well, when you put it in that perspective, it's like, well, now make it work kind of thing, knowing that that's the limitations that we're trying to have with everything that we've got to try and cram into it. So it makes
it's absolutely like saying, I've got this Formula One car. I want you to rebuild it, but you only get 1 cylinder.
Yeah.
And that's, oh man.
Trying to get it.
Right.
Yeah. It's that perspective. It sort of puts it all into thought. You said in our discussions before that it's not about the brand of a lens, but it's the design. I mean, again, I know we've spoken a lot about design specifically, but as a bit of a segue into getting to know about designs a little bit more specifically, why does the design, I guess, why is it more important than the brand?
Right. Well, I think I mentioned like most labs will have good designs now. I think that's a fair start. You can go pretty much anywhere and say, right, this is a good lens. It's given us good performance. I think we're reaching mathematically very much the top of what's possible with a lens design.
Yeah.
There are, like the Minkwitz condition, especially, we've really butted up against that, and we're having to invent new approaches to defining surfaces to be able to expand the mathematics of the progressive lenses. So if you have to go that far, it's showing that we're getting diminishing returns at that end of the lens. So what makes a design a design? Well, a good example, I think, is when they brought in, or when the industry brought in digital surfacing, and it was referred to sort of as freeform. The implication was we can solve any problem for any patient in any context, when it was really digital surfacing. And so you have to have a concept behind what you're trying to achieve. If it's a single vision lens, we have to have continuity of that power across the surface. Or if it's aspheric, how are we modifying that power across the surface? And progressives, I mean, look, progressives are just a really aspheric surface that doesn't have that radial symmetry. So everything has to have an idea behind it, right? And it's how we can pull those disparate parts together. So what are the weaknesses for every type of lens design? So if we look at an aspheric single vision, there are problems that come along with having a highly aspheric lens. That might be fitting or anything. So you can soften the impact of those and make it an easy to fit lens, or you can turn around and say, you know what, I'm demanding precision fitting and give it a really good optical performance. But that's where, design starts creeping into it. And then obviously progressives are where you start seeing, that really extreme cases where we know that we've got these conditions due to the power variation across the surface that are giving us this unwanted area of astigmatism on the side of the lens, especially down near the reading. So with those in mind, how do we move them around? And we're not thinking as an industry in terms of hard and soft anymore, but it still is a useful analogy, I think, the hardness and softness of a design. How quickly are we introducing these areas? And so you can make a very wide reading area, but at the same time, you have to give something up. You have to allow for the fact that these areas of sort of unwanted cylinder are going to be really rapidly introduced. And so the patient will be more aware of them. And so that's the manipulation of that, the movement of those parts of the lens surface around. That's where we think of, in progressive lenses especially, of design as living. That's sort of the design process. And that's how a patient will experience the lens and feel the lens, is their interaction with those. Now that varies according to person, but we do see that, I think primarily, there are 10 different ways to build a table, hundreds, an infinite number of ways to build a table. Almost every single one of them is going to hold your dinner plate up, but it's the aesthetic, is the interaction. I've got a specific desk that I'm sitting at the moment that's fairly ergonomic, but the dinner table at home isn't. So, these are the approaches I think that we look at from a design perspective, but it is that the interaction with aberrations, I think, is the primary thrust for how a patient experiences a lens.
And I think what's in the ideal world, would you say that, in theory, you'd understand all the lens designs on the market available to you, and then you'd pick and choose what's best in the circumstance, as opposed to maybe the more general thought of, a practice will pick a lab and they'll basically just get the majority of their lenses from a particular lab. Like, what are your thoughts on that approach? And, are they more invested in understanding lens designs and positives and negatives of them? And the lead-up question to that will be, or the follow-up question will be, how do you actually understand that, and how do you get that technical information to make that decision? Because I feel like that may be the reason why, maybe in theory it sounds like a good practice, but you throw it out in the real world, and it's like, well, are you going to get that information? What does that look like?
Yeah, it is. Like, as you say, the perfect world is, let's look at every lens design on its own merits. Let's have a look at the layouts. Do we want isocil plots, something like that, or isoprism plots or power plots? How are we going to define it? Whatever your preferred poison is in that front. We get educated on how we can, assess and prioritize various parts of that lens design, and then we can move forward with those as a practitioner. And look, I have watched practitioners work with one lab over another, and there's this unexplainable sort of X factor that we have to work towards with our interactions, like the professional interactions we have, to try and find out what it is about their practice style that works better with one lens than another. So we've watched them go from, say, lab A that was working well, but they really want to try lab B and they just can't seem to get it to work. Progressives are failing, patients are unhappy, so they go back to their original lab. And there's that X factor, that groove that you have to try and define. And I think that comes again back to understanding the core principles. From choosing a lab, how do you choose a lab? There are the mercantile considerations. How much am I spending for a lens? If I buy everything from them, I get a measure of they get a measure of exclusivity, and then we get about a discount. Yeah. True to a point. What are you giving up for that? Does the design philosophy actually align with how you want to prescribe? As you said, there are philosophies of design. There are thought processes.
They are. Absolutely. I've seen it firsthand. And you look at different lab suppliers or different lens suppliers, and you sit on a session, okay, this is what's important to us. These are the technologies that we've incorporated. And so, I totally can understand that. And I don't know if people ask those questions of their labs, and because that is part of the question too, is like, how do you find that sort of stuff out?
You just ask your rep, honestly. There should be some pathway with the company that you're working with to say, all right, well, why are the decisions that are being made in a lens design taking this pathway? Why are we going down this particular rabbit hole? It doesn't have to be an aggressive question. I don't think it should be an aggressive question,
not at all.
But I also don't think it's an unreasonable question. And so from my mind, the lens rep that can answer that question is the one that's absolutely worth working with. That's how you know you've hit a winner, is if they turn around and go, you know what, we're really interested in binocular vision. We're working on how BV works. We're looking at prioritizing the dominant eye versus the non-dominant eye, but we understand these interactions. That's what we're going towards. And once you get that level of engagement from the representative or from the lab itself, because the lens rep may not know, and that's fine. And it's okay to not know. That gets lost by the wayside as well. Some people, I think, feel this need to know everything. And there's an infinitely larger amount of information that I don't have, any awareness of compared to what I do have some awareness of. But knowing that you can just say, you know what, let's get back to you on that. That's the key. That's a really powerful sort of push that I think a company can have. We're not sure on that one, but you know what, we'll get back to you, and we will honestly and reliably get back to you on that in a reasonable time frame. Like, as an undergrad, I did a presentation, absolutely not in my field. It was in chemistry. And the whole point was to put me out of my comfort zone. And the supervisor that I had preparing me for that basically said, if you don't know in front of a room full of professors, say so.
Yeah. They'll call you out, right?
Right. Because I'm in front of a room full of experts, and there were questions, and she said, the correct response every time is, I'm not sure on that. I actually don't have that knowledge. I'll get back to you. Is it all right if we catch up after the presentation? And I'll get your details and I'll get back to you on that. Because those people in the room were spotting a hole in what I said and trying to help me along. And so that's the way I was encouraged to view it. They've spotted a gap. They're informing me of that, not in a mean way. And, this is a chance for me to push forward, and it's a chance for everyone in the industry to push forward. So that'd be my advice for everyone is to have a good, meaningful, engaged discussion. You might love color vision. Talk to a lab that works heavily in that. You might work in children's vision, myopia control, whatever your poison is. As a practitioner, you just look towards that and ask the questions in that space. And that's a really good entry point for the relationship that the practitioner and the company can have with each other as well.
And I guess when you start getting these answers, and invariably there'll be someone within the business that will have the answers, and the BDM or the lens rep that's, maybe taking the question first, may not, and they'll hopefully say that. But let's say you start getting some answers. How can someone that doesn't necessarily have the knowledge to assess and, I guess, properly diagnose the information that's being presented to them as being genuine, I guess, with regards to it, and I'm sure it is in some capacity, but is it more technical or is it more marketing? What's the best way for someone to basically review what's been said to them and determine whether what they've been told is actually a bit more of a marketing ploy or a bit more of an actual, no, this is actually technically based on something that's going to make a difference?
Look, inside our course, the CPD structure, we encourage interaction between all of the levels of the practice. So if you've got an optometrist coming in doing their CPD with us, part of what we actively push for is go in tomorrow and talk to your dispensers, and vice versa. The dispensers doing CPD, go and talk to your optometrist about it, because as we said, you can't know everything about everything. And so inside the practice, though, you do have a fairly wide range of knowledge levels and skill levels. And there's no no demand that the optometrist knows every single thing about every aspect of the practice, including lens design. And there's no demand that the dispenser knows every single aspect of optometry and how a refraction or a consultation is taking place. So inside the practice, you've really got that pathway already to start assessing it. You can take external pathways as well and just start looking at, honestly, you can almost Google the information or a claim that's being made now and get a range of responses on it. GPTs, so, AI engines are actually really powerful if you know how to use them. If you don't let them run with their own head, then they can actually give you that. And it keeps, I use ChatGPT a lot for coding. I love it for coding.
Yeah.
But every now and then, if I get lazy, I'll ask it to, help me with a shortcut and run through a concept like, for mapping out a ray trace, and you immediately watch it just break down and die. It just makes stuff up.
Yeah. Right. And so we're not using that as a benchmark unless we can ascertain whether it knows what it's talking about or not. I feel is that
yeah. I like to trick it actually and just ask it, not in a mean way, but ask it a question in a way that I know is wrong, and make sure it gives me the wrong answer, and then we can move forward and go, oh, okay, well, what if this was
the double negative?
Yeah. Just make it force its own proof. Or if it says, I'm trying to force you into a wrong answer, I'm trying to get you to hallucinate or to give me that pleasing answer, and it'll come back and say, it's a fundamental misunderstanding that you've just made there, mate. That's actually quite a handy thing, because you can use false ignorance to start forcing a validation of what you might have got as information from a lens rep or something like that as well. I mean, but the information absolutely is out there. It's not lens design isn't a really widely published field.
No.
So, right. I like it. I think it's great. Not many people do.
And it probably speaks to the fact that that's why there isn't as much as readily available, and you kind of have to, peel back the layers of the onion and get to the core of it. And it really is a mission. It's not something that's going to be handed to you or given to you. You've got to go looking for it. And I think that's the part of this episode of this particular episode. It's about how you can do that and why you do it. And obviously it all is, it's scoped on knowledge and being informative and then enabling, I guess, to understand. And in doing so, you do provide that proof or that evidence of that benefit to your patients. You've used the McDonald's analogy when it comes to talking about optical practices and lens quality. Yeah, no, I thought that was quite good. So would you mind, for the benefit of the audience, running through what that looks like?
McDonald's here. I think it applies to anything of scale.
Okay? Yes. So, and that's what we're getting at.
Right? So if I take any old burger joint that's running and operating at a massive scale, we've got, perhaps hundreds of locations or whatever. They're bound by their own size to the skill level of their least skilled person. So I can put a Michelin-rated chef into, if I'm going to get sued, I might as well get sued the whole way, McDonald's restaurant, and they could cook an amazing meal. The tools are all there. It exists, and I'm sure we'd be happy with the meal. But you can't have one of those in every single location. So that's one of the catches that you have with large scale. You could have really talented, gifted people in one location, and then another location, people who are disengaged because, I don't know, the boss is never there or something, whatever. But you have to build your systems now to cater for the disengaged location as opposed to the engaged location. So part of what we're trying to empower the practitioners to do is to say everyone should be engaged. Everyone should be looking to maybe not, the Michelin-rated McDonald's burger, but by the same token, like, it's not an impossibility, and it's possible to have that. What do they say? The rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah,
and it really will. So yeah.
So when it comes then to understanding how the progressive lens, specifically because that's where we've mentioned the designs, I guess more than most other lenses, can come into play when you're speaking to the offering that you're giving to your patients in that regard. I mean, at practice, and there are varying scopes of practice obviously out there, and there are some that value this type of knowledge, and there are others that aren't, because I think the ingredient and the ability of, again, if we go with that McDonald's analogy, with the Michelin star, I mean, I think it's the knowledge of what to do, where you're sort of going a bit above and beyond the process that you're told to do necessarily, or that's been instructed. It's that knowledge that makes the difference with being able to offer that level of service and provide the Michelin stuff. Because again, if you put that Michelin rated chef into the McDonald's kitchen, you're going to get, I would say, a Michelin
Yeah, pretty damn good burger,
meal.
right?
So, right. And the same, if you put the McDonald's, worker into the, and again, we're using this for the purpose of the example. It's not necessarily always the case, but if you, then you're probably going to get more of a McDonald's style burger. And so when it comes to the practice, like that knowledge will then, and I guess you've seen this happen firsthand, will then impart with regard to the service that you're giving your patients. And I think ultimately that's where it's at. And how do you, I guess, distinguish between those types of service offerings that are prevalent within the industry, and why would one want to be more of one than the other? Not saying one is worse.
Look, there are some practitioners who really love very systematic flow, and that's right. And look, that's how you have this large scale ability to operate. It works well in that context. We want something that's consistent, that is the same every single time. But when we're dealing with people, you have to make some sacrifices to get that level of consistency. You can't have the 638 visual acuity for every patient, but you can get it for a lot of them, but not if you're cutting corners on the processes or on the lenses themselves. So if we don't have the scope to provide, let's say, a full suite of position of wear measurements at every location that we have, or, then we have to start making assumptions. And with those assumptions comes a compromise in the lens performance. And that, I think, probably better, a more directed analogy for our industry would be that one. If you don't tell me the tilt, it's 8 degrees. If you don't tell me the wrap, it's 5. That's it. And by doing that, you can guarantee a fairly consistent level of performance and predictability in the lens. If you allow those constraints to be measured and to be put into a lens, you have to have surety that it's being those measurements are being taken consistently, reliably, and aren't being misunderstood. Now, I've watched examples of misunderstandings of back vertex distance put into practice, and it's ruined progressive lens designs.
So that's the thing too, right? Like when you've got just because you're taking the measurements, you've also got to make sure that that's being done correctly too. And I feel like proper use of those tools are just as critical as the tools themselves.
Oh, I've watched orders go through, sent through to me for something's wrong with this, we can't figure it out. And so how have you got a negative and a positive pandoscopic tilt on the same patient? And the equipment that they've used hasn't worked out correctly, mainly because the person who was operating it, again, wasn't comfortable with what it was that they were trying to achieve.
Yeah.
What does a good result look like? What is this piece of equipment doing? How am I going to use it? How is this being implemented? That core understanding, and it doesn't have to be overly technical, but having a core understanding of what the output should look like and how we're arriving at it, what it means that you don't get a simultaneously negative and positive tilt.
Okay, so if we jump back to progressive designs specifically, an analogy that we spoke about prior to our conversation today was this whole concept about the intermediate area. And I think this was stemmed, and I'm not going to name companies here, but when we're talking about the philosophies of lenses, there are the companies that are a large part of, the lens designs that we end up having in store, and that come from different parts of the world. And some come from, so there's a particular part of the world, and people that spun the whole place together, where they're based. I mean, the community read up and down, not side to side. So when we're talking about intermediate use and the intermediate use of lenses, and we're getting a specific on a particular, I guess, concept here, the lens philosophy works well in one area, and maybe it does because you understand and know parts of that. But when we're speaking about the intermediate area as well, specifically in this instance, and this was the context is how the question came up or the conversation came up, you said that intermediate is like being a knife edge.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that actually means? And can you go through about unpacking the sacred intermediate zone of a progressive lens?
Yeah. Look, I think one of the issues that we've got with the articulation or describing progressive lenses to patients is we've got there's a distance and an intermediate and a near zone. And if you've got an 0.75 ad, the lens is going to feel like it's working that way, but it actually isn't. It's an interaction between your residual accommodative power and how the progressive lens is working. And so initially it feels like there's an intermediate zone that works on your computer screen, right? But the reality of a progressive lens design is as soon as you move into the corridor, it ceases to be stable. That's the reason why we call it a corridor. You transit through it. You don't stay there. And so it becomes metastable. And at any given point, yes, we can calculate or we can measure the power at any given point in that progressive corridor, but the tiniest movement up or down, and you've modified the power again. And so there's a constantly changing, a smooth transition of power as you move through the corridor. And I think that this is really one of the core misunderstandings about progressive lenses, that and why does the near zone shrink? But this idea of it's not a usable portion of the lens in the sense that we keep articulating it to our patients. This is the intermediate and you should be able to see the computer through it. Kind of. You should be able to get a point where you'll be able to focus a point, something on your screen. But if you move your eyes side to side, you're in the narrowest component of that progression, of that progressive lens design. This is the least usable part of it. If you want something that's got full width, you have to have a different design. You have to treat the lens differently. You can manipulate it. You can play with your powers and get an intermediate sort of functioning progressive with the top zone in the where the distance nominally would be. Or you can look at digressive lenses. You can look at all of these specific use lenses. But I would love to have the industry move away from saying it's got a distance, an intermediate, and a near. Because it's distance, yes, near, yes. They're the two stable points on the lens. Everything that happens in between is guiding you from one point to the other.
And would it be fair to say then, in your opinion, that the narrower the intermediate or the shorter the intermediate, the better the lens? Or is that too dependent on the needs of the patient? But I guess it's a general theory.
Yeah, look, I like to look at the way patients are interacting with their current design. So you do need to have a habitual wear context. If they're wearing a long corridor, it's a fairly softish sort of feeling. They're not getting big, hard reading areas, things like that. It's wise to keep them in something that feels that way. It has a similar sort of parity to what they've worn before. But if they're rejecting it, if they're saying, I really don't like this, then you can start making wholesale large changes to the design. You can shorten a corridor. Certainly when we're looking at high ads, so when we get sort of 250, so anything above that, or complex needs like prism, if we've got asymmetric prismatic needs, anything like that, we really do try to get as short a corridor as possible. We just want the patient out of this unstable zone and into a stable part of the lens as quickly as we can.
Yeah. So I guess in that instance, you'd be really looking at the patient's needs and seeing what's right for them based on what they're used to. I guess if there are specific needs, the aim would be to try and get them out of that knife edge zone or that intermediate zone. I like the concept that you said that effectively, we talk about three parts of the progressive lens when in theory it's actually two, and one is the bridge between the two.
And look, that's the heart of progressive lens design, is how do you build that bridge?
Yeah.
Every single parameter in the expression that makes up that progression zone or that corridor, every single part of that expression is part of how the patient will define how the patient experiences it,
for sure,
whether they like it or not. And that's where this feeling of, I really love design X, but I don't love design Y, or design Z is just the one for me. But the way that you move from the distance to the near is that part of that feeling and that experience for them.
And it's funny, it's always a part, it's how that intermediate part is the part that doesn't matter, but it also is the part that matters the most, because it does affect how the lens will actually be received by the patient.
The least useful part of the lens that defines the whole experience. Yes,
pretty much. So a bit of a contradiction in some capacity, but that's what I'm sort of getting towards it. But understanding all these technical aspects of the progressive lens, and obviously then it will tie into how the patient is using it and getting the most out of it. More and more so, I feel like it's hard to get that kind of information from the labs. I'm not sure what your experience is, but I guess how does a practice match the lens design to meet the patient's evolving needs? Is it lifestyle questions? Is it understanding more of a perspective of the lens design itself and reaching out for that information specifically? I know that with Optical, and I'll mention it really briefly, like we use lens maps quite a lot. So we'll actually map a lens and we'll view it physically from that point of view. And that sometimes gives us an analogy of understanding what the actual lens is and where its strengths and weaknesses may or may not lie from that point of view. But I guess how would a practice go about, A, making sure they're picking the right lens, and then B, ensuring that the lenses that they are, that they are using, so maybe lifestyle questions, and then how that lab is providing a lens that's meeting the needs of the patient.
Right. So how do you pick from a stable of lenses? How are you going to pick?
And how are you going to make sure that that's what you're getting and that's what the patient actually needs? It's that, how are you picking the right
one? Well, VV is, I think, really underappreciated as part of the patient experience. So binocular vision and the way that they interact with the lens. Prism, at the heart of it all, starts speaking to how we can define the patient's experience. So are they experiencing any prism? Is what did the thinning prism look like in their previous design?
Yeah.
And that comes from things that are just as simple as taking a really good set of entry measurements when they come to the practice. Not just, let's throw them into the lens meter and see what the powers are. And we need that. But to find out, what's the prism at that reference point for them? Have they been fit correctly? And are they used to, progressive lenses are aspheric inherently. So, if they're not fit at the fitting cross, what does that mean for the patient experience? So we can start recreating what they liked, what they didn't like about that design. So how do you approach that from getting a comparable lens from a new lab? We need to have an understanding of what the existing corridor looked like, what their ad profile looked like, how that interacted with the base prescription, the distance prescription, base curve, and like I said, just in prism as well. Once we know that picture, and then we can pick out the pieces that the patient either liked or didn't like. You can use corridor. I personally like to use corridor a lot as a means for compressing or modifying the design to get what the patient's used to experiencing. And their dislikes and likes about their previous design, what would you change? What would you keep the same? They're really powerful questions for the patient to answer because they may just turn around and go, everything about this is fine. And you go, all right, don't mess with it. Then you have that panic point of saying, well, the ad's gone up by 0.25 or 0.50. How am I going to do this? And so you have to start again looking to compression of the design, or, the complexity of the design as well, I think is good to know, because if we know that there are just normative value, like just standard values used for, say, position of wear, that starts telling us our story about what they liked to wear as well. So if we take them out of that wearing pattern into something that's got a full position of wear suite of measurements, that actually can be not problematic, but a little bit confronting at the first experience of the lens for the patient as well. So for me, in general terms, if I'm looking at a lens stable, a suite or portfolio of lenses, my first point will be, what are my corridor lengths available? What are my biasing conditions that I've got available to me? So are we looking at lenses that are biased towards distance vision, biased towards near, something that's got more of a balanced feeling across the lens? And then how do the corridors interact with that? How are we working in that space? What is the impact of the corridor upon something like an isosil map, for example? How is the power being introduced? And that starts giving me a feeling for, what's the philosophy? I mean, we've said that a few times today. What's the philosophy? How are they approaching the introduction of these points into a lens design? And then that, once I know that, I can recognize the features that are in the patient's existing lenses and start replicating it or moving away from them as the case may be.
And what would you say for, again, depending on who we're speaking to, there are some people that obviously don't have the option of really choosing where the lenses are coming from. So, obviously there could be decisions that are made within the practice, and it could be commercial in nature. And that's the first and foremost reason as to why it's been selected. And there are a whole number of reasons as to why. But if you're in that situation and you've got to tailor lens recommendations based on a limited or narrow portfolio, what sort of tips could you give somebody in that predicament, I guess, to at least get the most out of the situation that they're in?
I think understand the relationship between corridor length and how the patient will perceive, again, it's not a great term, but the hardness of the design. So short corridors feel harder, longer corridors feel softer. What are they wearing and what do they like or not like about that? Usually though, at a certain point in once the ad hits about 2, we just have to start hardening designs up anyway. And any software that is automatically generating like a nice advanced lens design will tend to harden things up natively, because the reading area just contracts too much if you let a soft design, a long corridor sort of just float along merrily into a high ad situation. So if depending on the optimization parameters that are put in, you will find that tend to become slightly shorter corridors, which will have the effect of giving the patient a slightly harder feel. It moves them out of that metastable region in the corridor first, and then drops them into a stable reading zone, which is more comfortable for them anyway, mostly. So if we walk in and say, I've only got these design parameters available, I would put them into boxes of, what are the biasing? So ask the rep, what's the purpose of this? Is this like an active style lens, something that someone would use if there's a lot of attention paid to stabilizing the distance? Or is this something where a lot of attention is being paid to maximizing the near? We've got that old problem of, what was the old analogy? You can have it done fast, you can have it done cheap, and you can have it done right, but you can only choose 2. And
Two of
this
them.
is, you can have distance, you can have near, or you can have balanced across the whole thing. But you can't have all of that. You've got to choose something that is going to be the main focus or the main thrust of this lens. And ask that of the rep, ask that of the company. Once we know that, look at the corridors. How can I manipulate the corridors to match what the patient's already wearing? And even just with those two thought processes, you can usually get some really nice results for your patient before you start looking at position of wear, compensated powers, and really going for it. You can build some you can use those parameters to build some really great lenses.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I feel like, and people that are listening to this, even if they're just taking that home with them today or as a concept and reaching out to their particular representative and getting that information, it will change the ball game for them, I feel, with regards to what they're offering and getting more out of it for them and their patients. An interesting concept that we spoke about as well, we first discussed the idea of this episode and what we're going to talk about, was an idea that I like quite a lot. I want you to unpack a little bit for me, which is the idea of labs trying to remake, the labs try to remake rates and warranties and having that all tied into education. I mean, I think that as a conceed really is quite powerful, and I like it a lot. So I'd like you to unpack that a bit and talk to me more about that.
Yeah. So we had a thought process that sort of slipped in, and just as a sort of an organic process, that if a given laboratory said, you know what, we know that a certain practice has got a very high level of clinical knowledge, a very high level of practical knowledge, and we've observed that as a result of this skill level, they have lower remakes. So that becomes our benchmark. And because they're cheaper for the lab to work with, they're more profitable for the lab to work with, but it's also good for the reputation of the product itself and good for the practitioner's reputation. So there's this synergy that rolls across all of those points. And so we thought, look, what would happen if labs turned around and said, there's a minimum level of education that we require for us to have a progressive lens warranty? What is a course that would exist to say, you understand enough about progressive lenses that we're confident that you're going to be prescribing them, taking the measurements, doing everything on point. So that if there is a problem that needs a warranty, we know it's an honest one. That's all good. These things happen. Life is good. And that becomes a very profitable group because they can be given better terms, longer. I mean, effectively, you can give someone a warranty that's infinite if you know that they're not going to be.
That's right.
Framing the damn thing, right? That was sort of the bones of the concept. What was really funny though is just last night, I watched a short video on, of all things, the meals that was served in the Western saloons in the USA. There's a point here, don't worry. So people would go into the saloon in the 1800s and they'd have a table of free food. And you would buy your drink, and in exchange, part of buying your first drink for the night, you would get access to this table of food. And in San Francisco, they took this to absolute extremes. They were giving, these huge spreads of food with, meat and seafood and all these things. And it became this arms race between all of the saloons in San Francisco to have the best free food. And there was a point where no one could buy enough drinks in a night to offset the loss that these places were making on these big spreads of food. So they all got together and had a meeting to say, we have to stop this. We're going broke. And I don't know the exact name of it. You can look it up. It's a documented meeting. Unfortunately, the outcome of the meeting was that they realized if any one single saloon chose not to end the free food policy, they would own the entire market in the town. And that's the problem, I think, that led to the resistance. Really open, wide terms on progressive lens warranties, letting people get away with whatever, practitioner errors, just not paying attention, not caring, any of these things. Letting people get away with that has led to a situation where the companies that say, no, we're going to demand a level of knowledge now, will lose to the people who just keep giving away hand over fist. That's the catch, right? So you see, there was a point behind my San Francisco story.
I get it. It makes total sense. I have another story on the saloon sort of scenario, but it's completely off optics, but I'm going to explain it shortly. It's how the shot came about. I'm not sure if when you have the shot of,
I don't know how that came about.
So it was back in those saloon days as well, in the Wild West, and a cowboy would walk into a saloon and they would say, I don't have any money, but I've got a bullet. And so they would give the bullet in exchange for a short nip of alcohol. And so because of that exchange, it was then referred to as a shot.
That's cool.
And that's how we do two shots. I mean, when you said that, I was like, now that leads to nothing, right? That's there's no relevance in that, but there's a tie-in with when you said the salons, the American salons. I thought of that, but yeah, I totally agree. I know that there is obviously this philosophy now, or there's this movement, I guess, that that labs need to kind of offer this unwavering warranty and assurance. If they don't, then someone else will. And that in turn just brings in the whole, it lowers the bar across the board. And I definitely feel like there's merit in that. And it would be controversial, but definitely merit in the context that it just speaks to the fact that the more educated your team is, the better outcomes you're going to get in any case. And that's what we should be aspiring. It's about making sure the team is on board, they are educated, they know what they're doing. You don't want remakes because it's bad for business anyway. So even if your lab's giving it to you, that doesn't mean that you should be using it. And so I feel like there is that essence of education, and it brings it back to that whole concept of the knowledge and the confidence in what we're doing, and understanding the design. And that's
one of the things I think, if there's a technology that is unique to a company, it's in their best interests to be articulating that to their client base, so to the practitioners. But also, one of the things I think that's missing, and it's driven by our desire to make our patients believe that everything is good all the time.
Yeah.
But we should be able to say there are parts of a lens design that just operate suboptimally because of the physical universe we occupy. It just demands that physics works this way. And so some things you just can't get rid of. And it's our job to make sure that the patient's experiencing those optimally in a way that isn't negatively affecting their interaction with the world. So from that point, I'm really a strong advocate of allowing progressive lens, the corridor, right? So the practitioner to say, it's great. There's no line on the lens. It's not a bifocal. You'll move smoothly from distance to near. In some circumstances, we can use this to our advantage if, you've got a low ad, whatever. But that's our problem. We'll work on this solution, but not every part of the lens works perfectly. And how do we make this work for you as a patient? That's the message we can send to our patient base. And the practitioner has to be really secure in themselves. It's, that if you're not secure in your knowledge and you're not secure in yourself as a practitioner, then it's difficult to make those statements.
Yeah, no, and that makes total sense. I was going to say that that comes down to the confidence that you have in your knowledge and knowing what the limitations are and being able to articulate those limitations. Because if you do, then all of a sudden it changes the nature of the conversation. And it's almost expectation management in some ways, where you're sort of saying...
The catch is, if you have a patient come in and they want a lens to do a specific task, and you know that it's not physically possible, right? But you say that it's, I'll get that to work. It won't be long before the patient figures out that it wasn't possible.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it'll catch
so you saying that's just not physically possible, the patient might go somewhere else. All right. And if the other practitioner has said, I can get it to do that, if physics says no, physics will say no for the other practitioner as well. We don't live in a multiverse. So you'll have someone who's, been given, I guess, a demonstration of your honesty and your integrity and your ability to preempt any issues that might be happening with a lens design in those situations. That's powerful. That's just as powerful as getting it right, as being honest and having a good, clear knowledge of what is not possible.
Absolutely. I love that, the way, as we sort of start to conclude this, I think that's an awesome way to start to wrap things up. But I think, so if we start looking at this, I guess, this in totality, if there was one shift that you'd like to see in how independent practices, and I say independent practices because they generally have the ability to modify how they operate and change what they're doing. But, if there is one shift you'd like to see in this space, like, what would it be? And how would that, I guess, resonate?
Be clinical. Don't be retail.
Yeah. Okay. That's a really good point.
You own the narrative for the patient, and it's for the patient's benefit. If you're a retailer, then you're being completely driven by everything else that's happening in the market. So if there's a sale going on, you're now beholden to that sale. If there's advertising going on, you have to be reactive to that. If you're clinical, the thrust, the core of what's happening between you and that person who's in your consult room is solely driven by that person.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. I feel like that a lot of what we speak about here has happened because of the retail aspect, and we haven't really spoken about that specifically, how we really work in this industry that is half retail, half clinical. And sometimes the retail is so business driven from the point of view of being the success of the business that we sometimes focus so much on that and not on the clinical. And if we can flip that narrative more and more, and as an independent do it, it actually does help the business side of things as well. And I think the more that we speak about that, I think the more hopefully that will happen, because I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah. Look, you can have a clinical interaction with the patient. It might end up in, look, what is beyond what the patient was expecting to hear in terms of a quote at the end of it, right? But they've got the right to say no. And you've got the right to ask, because you're addressing their concerns. So two of these can happen, and they don't have to be a combative interaction.
No.
If the patient says, that's more than what I was thinking, you go, okay, well, let's have a talk about what are the aspects of this that we can change to get it to where you're comfortable.
Invariably, what you hear more often is that once you do put it out there, it's like, oh, okay, well, now that you've explained it to me that way, I actually want that. I don't want to be away with that now that you've told me that this is the potential outcome that I'm going to get, and it being, superior or better for me. So I feel like it's that assumption that whether it's a price thing, whatever it may be, it's, if you make that assumption that they're not interested because of that, but you haven't taken the time to go through and explain it. If you did, well, I think you'd be surprised at the outcome of it. And I think a lot of people found that to be the case.
Yeah. How many times have we had people come back saying, if I had have known, I would have gotten the better lens or a different frame. I didn't know. Well, it's our job to articulate. And look, we've got to sort through all of the information. This is, I guess, part of what we were talking about today with education. Our job is to sort the information out. But we take the parts that are relevant to the patient, present them to them. And if they don't want that, okay, that's fine. But that's our job. They came through the front door of the practice with an expectation for a resolution. They have a problem and there's an expectation of a resolution, and that's what we should be presenting them with.
Yeah. I'm with you on that. I totally agree. Thank you so much for the insights and your thoughts today. It's been really thought-provoking and been really interesting. I love talking about this sort of stuff and getting intricate with lenses and the importance of them and what they play. So on that note, if our listeners want to find out more information about yourself and the work that you're doing, the course, how can they do that? What's the best way that they can get in touch?
Easiest way would be via the website. So it's www.AAOO.net.au. Super simple for that one, or hit us up on social. That we're all sort of all over the place there. But there are no bad questions. If anyone's got anything that they want to reach out and discuss, but all of the course notes, course materials, the outlines and that sort of stuff, and the pathway for registration's all on there for you as well.
Cool. And we'll put those links in the show notes as well. So if anyone's interested in finding out more, jump onto the show notes and the links will all be there for you to go through and check out. So thank you, Grant. I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, mate. Really appreciate it too. Cheers.
Stay connected by subscribing to The Focused View and visiting our website www.thefocusedview.com.au for additional resources and episode summaries. We look forward to your company again in our next episode. Until then, keep focused. I'm Michael Nasser. Bye for now.